All right, good day to everybody. Welcome to another installment of our monthly episode, Calmly Considered, here at Faith Seeking Understanding. I am Allan and I am the self-appointed Anselm Chair, I should say self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Theology and Podcast Culture at Faith Seeking Understanding University, where all seekers are welcome to ponder profound things for free. I think I gave my title wrong. It's Podcast Theology and Culture, but titles don't matter to me anyway. And my conversation partner, Michael Cruz, who is also has the title of the Grand Poobah Chair of Economics and Public Theology at Faith Seeking Understanding University. Michael, good to see you. How are things out there in Kansas City, Missouri?
We are doing great. We're celebrating Kansas City football this week.
Yes, you are.
We are on a roll.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. I love it. And I'm coming to you from the bustling metropolis of Ashland, Ohio, where our downtown does not just have one stoplight. I think we got three.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're just up and happening. Yeah. So anyway, all right. So it's December and we're all in the throes of getting ready for Christmas and all of that. And one of our topic for today is actually is the world globally is the world getting better or worse? Are in reference to living conditions. Probably titled this episode For Better or For Worse, right?
Yeah, right.
For richer or for poorer, right? Is the world getting better in reference to living conditions? And we're gonna drill down on that. Let's begin with a passage of scripture that actually you mentioned to me before we went on.
Right.
And I'm going to read that, and then we'll launch into the conversation from there. This is Isaiah 65, and I'm going to read. I'm just going to read 17 through 25. It's a rather long passage, but it is scripture, right? So we should listen to it. All right, this is God speaking. For I'm about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy and its people as a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it, or the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant that lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be, and my chosen shall enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity, for they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord and their descendants as well. Before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, but the serpent, its food shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountains, says the Lord. So this is a prophetic vision. We get this throughout the prophets. God says, I'm going to do something brand new. Michael, what are your thoughts, particularly in reference to starting with verse 20 about an infant just living a few days? Infants will not live just a few days. Anyone who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and those who fall short of 100 will be accursed. And as one who plans to retire in a few months, all I can think of, man, what a load on Social Security that was, right?
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
It's already under stress.
Right.
Anyway, what do you think about this vision?
Well, as somebody who studied demography over my course of my lifetime, this passage has always been very interesting because we're talking about life expectancy and infant mortality, and it's all very biblical here.
Yeah.
And I think the part that is interesting is that this passage, of course, is being presented as this sort of what would be an unheard of state of human existence. This idea that these things would occur. This is what they're looking at. So what does that say about the circumstance that they were living in? What was normal at that time? And I think if you look across human history, going back a couple hundred years and on back, life expectancy at birth was about 30 years for most of humanity. Now, people often get confused as to what that means. That doesn't necessarily mean, that doesn't mean that people only live to be 30 years old. There are a lot of people who live to be well past 30 years old. There are people who lived into old age. But on average, you take the average person born, the average person is only going to live to be 30 years old. And a big part of that, not exclusively, but a big part of that was infant mortality. It was very common across the world for 1 in 4 children to die between birth and their first birthday. And as many as 4 out of 10 children would die by their 5th birthday. And so you had children, that brings down the averages. If the number of people born are dying very early, then obviously that brings down the averages. What we have seen over the past 100 to 200 years is a remarkable increase in life expectancy. Yeah. And I should tell you also, having studied sociology, I think sociologists, demographers, so on would tell you that life expectancy is probably about the single best measure for telling how well a society is doing, because so many pieces have to go together well to fit well together in order for life expectancy to increase.
Right.
And so it's probably one of the best measures. We are now looking at life expectancy in the richer nations at anywhere from about 77 to 79 years life expectancy at birth versus 30 years, 200 years ago. Even in the poorest continent in the world, Africa, it's at about 65.
Yeah.
And so what you're seeing is this escalating rise in life expectancy across the world. It's not 100, but it's not 30. It's increased by more than 40, 45 years, going on 50 years more than what it had been known historically. And the number of children who die, I said earlier, it was 1 in 4. It's down to a fraction of a percent of children in the richer nations, at least, in terms of the number of children that die between their birth and their first birthday. And so in some ways, what we are seeing is something that's beginning to approach the reality that Isaiah prophesies as this new creation, which is just this unheard of improvement in human well-being. So when I read that passage, every time I see that, it's just like, that's just amazing. And so on the one hand, I want to say, yes, the world is so much better. I mean, we're reaching prophetic heights here in terms of what's happening. And it's not everywhere in the world, but the trajectory is all the same across most of the world. And yet, do we feel like that the world is a great place at this point? There seems to be so much strife, so many issues happening in the world, so many threats. And so even though those demographic things have changed, has the world really gotten better? How do you assess that? What's your take for the world having gotten better or not?
Right. I mean, and the one thing that strikes me when you have this conversation is the number of necessary things that have to come together.
Right.
So when you talk about the increase of the lifespan, which is, you're right, is an excellent indicator. There are lots of things that have to come together. We're going to talk through these things, but it's diet, it's sanitation, it's medicine, it's literacy, and you and I had some conversation beforehand. It's about freedom and free societies, and that all of these things contribute. And by the way, to say that things are getting better is not to deny that we have issues and we have problems, and there are places in the world where things are not good. So this is not a Pollyannish kind of thing. But it's also not, we're also saying, Chicken Little, step to the side, please, because there are things that are happening that are very positive and very good. That, as by the way, as Christians, we should welcome. We should welcome human flourishing, right?
Right.
I mean, absolutely, we should do that. So let's start, and I'm going to try and put something up on the screen, and we'll see if it works, and that you gave to me. And by the way, folks, these are on the description in both in both the podcast and video cast. If you want to look at those things now, you can. And if you're driving and listening to the podcast, don't look at them now.
Not a good idea.
Don't link and drive. Not a good idea. Michael, can you see that?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. Gotcha.
Okay, so then that means everyone else can. So
Right.
you had said about, we were talking and you had said something about people, you know, how do we feel? How do I feel? When you ask people, is the world getting better or not? It's interesting that you give to me these statements that you sent it to Lincoln. It said all three statements are true at the same time, and they are.
Mhm.
And so when I see this, I want you to comment on this, but when I see this, I say to myself, the response depends on the question, doesn't it?
Yeah, right.
Right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
The number one, the world is awful. How do we know it's awful? 5.2 million children die every year. That's a terrible number. Everybody would agree with that.
Right.
And if that's the only thing I hear, then I am more probably likely to say the world is awful. But if you go to number two and you say 61 million children would have died this year if we still had the global child mortality rate of the past. You
Right.
go, wow, 61 million children are alive.
Yeah.
I think actually it sounds like things are getting better, doesn't it?
Right.
So it depends on the question.
Right.
And so how does that then figure in to how people feel about the world?
Yeah. And of course, that last piece about the world could be much better.
Yeah.
We demonstrated that. We have made the world better. It can get even better is I think the last part of that. And so I think the dynamic is, and I can point to all sorts of research and interesting books that I've read that just point to how we are conditioned as human beings. This is not a criticism. It's just who we are as human beings.
Yeah.
To see threats, to elevate threats, things that we are worried and concerned about.
Yeah.
We see those much quicker than we do the positive. We see the individual facts about something that's distressing without seeing the long, big term trend and trajectory of things that are happening beyond our vision. You know, those global things that are changing. So it's in some ways it's predictable that we would have a hard time seeing that this is improving. But I think what's important is that the world has been improving. It's been improving dramatically, and it can get better. If your perception is that the world is getting worse, that things are falling apart, that things are getting worse and worse, that leads to defeatism, and it discourages people from being parts of the solution. And instead, if you understand that the world is getting better, you can look at ways in which the world is becoming better and reflect upon those and say, how do we be a part of doing that more, faster, better, in terms of the world becoming better?
So what I'm hearing you say, Michael, is that often, and we do this, I do this, we all do it. We tend to draw general large conclusions from anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
Right. So let's go back to a discussion we had a couple months ago on socialism versus capitalism. We talked a little bit about healthcare. You know, if I'm not a fan of socialized medicine, even though I know very little about it, if I'm not a fan of what they have in Canada, I can find somebody in Canada who's had a horror story to tell. Right.
Right.
And that then proves we don't want that in the United States.
Right.
By the same token, I always, when we were having this debate about health insurance, healthcare, when the 2012 election, I want to say it was, or 2008, one of the lines we kept hearing from some people was, our healthcare system is broken. And then they would tell some kind of anecdotal story, a nightmare, to prove it was broken. Well, I don't think our health system is broken. I think it's actually pretty good. I think the problem is there's too many people in our country that don't get to participate in it.
Yeah, right.
Right. That's the problem. But
Right.
it's not, but to say, oh, it's all broken. And let me tell you the story about my cousin who went to the emergency room, right?
Right. Yeah.
So we're taking anecdotal evidence and drawing these sweeping conclusions.
Right.
And so that's what we're doing here. Fair enough?
Fair enough. Yeah. And I would add to that, just as a personal example recently, I occasionally during my lunch hour, I like to turn on a YouTube clip, or I've got programs that I've recorded on TV, stuff like that. I like to watch while I'm eating my lunch. One of them I've been into in recent weeks and months has been air disasters on the Smithsonian channel, which analyzes various airplane crashes. And so Melissa and I watch those sometimes together. And so we're like both to this point of like, gee, I don't, ever want to get on an airplane again. All these terrible things could happen. Yet I have no problem getting out in my car and driving down to Quick Trip, get a drink. And I'm probably about, several times more likely to get killed or injured in a car accident than I am on an airplane. Yeah. So the information that is immediately available to us, because now I've been watching that, I have that information immediately available. We overreact to that relative to what the reality is sometimes. And so we see things that are scary. People that have agendas to move public opinion a certain direction know that. So they highlight the things that create the greatest fear, the greatest anxiety, because they know that that's what people will take away, not the abstract, large picture of what's happening.
Yeah, in the information that you gave me that I was reading, certainly and rightly so, says the media is partly to blame. Right. But we don't want to lay everything at the feet of the media. We do that too much. But the reality is they also know what gets ratings. That's right. And we're the ones that give them the ratings. Yeah. Right. And so if it bleeds, it leads. Right. Yeah. So the media is going to rush to cover. This is why you have people on cable news channels, reporters standing out in the midst of a hurricane, trying to keep from getting blown over. It's the silliest thing you ever saw, to be honest. But why do they do it? And people can complain about it, but they do it because we watch it. Right. Right. Yeah. And just think about all the popular shows that are crime shows in some way, that probably are among shows that are the highest rated, simply because that draws our attention. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So, yeah, I'm not so sure that we could get a highly rated show that called Today's Good Neighbor, and do a good deed, right? Yeah. You do, in the 19th century, you probably couldn't get more than a dozen people in the town to go to some poetic reading of Longfellow, but boy, the whole town would turn out for the hanging in the public square, right? Right. So we do have this tendency toward this. So let's kind of get into some of this. And I've got another thing. You can see I take it the extreme poverty one I've got up there. Right. You can see that, Michael? Right. Yeah. Okay. I want to make sure it's up there. I want to just kind of go down this and talk about it. So the one thing I liked about this article, and again, it's linked in the descriptions on both the video and podcast, because it goes through all of the different, there's all kinds of different things that in a conglomerate add to the current situation in the world. So the first is extreme poverty. Right. And if you look on that graph, and I wish I could just highlight the graph by itself, but I don't think there's a way I can do it. Yeah, I'm looking just click on it or not. I've not tried it. I've been clicking on it, but it's not doing what I want to do. So I can read it from what you're showing. Yeah. You can read it, and hopefully others can read it. And again, for those, So if you look from 1820, okay, so purple is the extreme poverty, right? The number of people in extreme poverty. So in 1820, 89.15% were extreme poverty. 10.85% were not. So basically, most people in 1820 are living in what you would call extreme poverty. And I believe it was like, if I looked at the one map, it would be in today's dollars, less than $2 a day. Right. Yeah. So it's pretty extreme. Right. Okay. So when you go up to 2015, the number of people living in extreme poverty is just below 9%. 90% do not live in extreme poverty. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people in the green who aren't living in poverty, correct?
Absolutely.
But what we're saying is there are, and we'll get to those numbers in a minute. But when you're talking extreme poverty, that has definitely dropped.
Right.
I mean, that's incredible when you think about it.
And extreme poverty, basically what these researchers are referring to, that they're trying to define sort of a basic minimal existence that a person has to have in order to subsist, and to have that sort of continually and perpetually. And so basically what they're saying is that 90% of the world no longer is in that level. Now, there's hundreds of millions, maybe a billion or two, that are only a little bit above that level.
Yeah.
You know, so they aren't wealthy. They are not affluent or living by European or American standards.
Right.
But they also have escaped that level of that precariousness of just forever living on the edge of barely existing. So yes, that's what they mean by extreme poverty.
So there's a lot more to be done, but the point simply is 90% approximately 75% of the population is better off today than they would have been in 1820.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. All right. So can I move down to literacy?
Yeah.
Okay. Now this is interesting. So in 1800, only 12% of the world's population could read. Right? Read and write, I guess.
Yeah.
And this is for the population who are 15 years and older. Okay. That's not too many.
No. And in fact, that even seems high to me based on historical standards. Going back even before that, I suspect it was lower before 1800.
Yeah. I think you're probably right on that. And in 2016, 86%, a little over 86% is now literate. Again, now tell me, Michael, why is literacy important for the thriving and the flourishing of a population?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. That mathematics, when you're talking about being able to interact with other people in terms of commerce, you're talking about being able to govern, to be able to read documents, to understand what your legislature is saying, to know if you agree or disagree, how you're going to vote, how you're going to contact, organize other people. Just from the standpoint of being able to trade, knowing how to do math and knowing how to read instructions and all of that, because you know how to read and write, that facilitates my ability to do commerce with you, to exchange ideas with you, to cooperate with you in ways that would be if one or the other of us were not able to read and write.
Right.
So it really expands what they call the human capital of people, and the idea of just learning, lifelong learning. How do you adapt? How do you change to situations as they develop? The ability to read, to reflect, to learn new information. Yeah.
You know, one of the things I've thought about is that, and I've seen some numbers about education, people going to college and get majors in something, and like 70% or say something, it's a high number of people who major, whatever they major in college, that whatever they're doing is not part of their major.
Right.
And of course, this is talked about as a terrible thing. And, there may be some disadvantages to that, but I keep thinking, boy, just education, right? Just having gone through and gotten a degree, says something to me. If I'm an employer, and I, as a pastor of churches we've been an employer, we are an employer. There may be somebody applies for a job that doesn't have a degree in the area we're looking for, but the fact that they have a degree matters to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, by the way, I'm not saying those who don't have a degree that, they're less intelligent. I'm just simply saying when I see someone with a degree that tells me that they have had some discipline and they've been able to get through certain things and able to think in a certain way. that they're able to get that degree.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and I think the numbers are still the case, that if you have a college degree, your percentage of earning more income is higher, right?
Yes, your
So
opportunity.
that's still true. And by the way, this is not a dismissal of vocational training. I love vocational training. I think it's a great thing. I think any kind of training is good.
We need a lot more vocational training.
We need a lot more vocational training. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I'm 100% with you on that.
Yeah.
And
but even in vocational training, you have
Yeah.
to know how to read instruction manuals. You have to know how
Yep.
to read specs. You have to know how to do math to calculate what the distance is that I need to cut this length of pipe to. You need to,
Mhm.
on and on and on and on. And I would say that with this literacy rate, that this isn't necessarily saying that everybody, when they say literate, can sit down and write a treatise on,
Right.
we're talking basic functional reading math, that people can do it at that level. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So the fact that the world is more literate is also added to this.
Right.
Okay, well, let's talk about health, or let's talk about global child mortality. And boy, if there is one place where we have just improved, because you're looking at 1800, 56.7% of children, 43.3% of children die within the first 5 years.
Correct.
So that means that if you and your wife, if she gets pregnant 6 times, 3 of those children are likely to be dead before the age of 5. That's an astounding thing.
Yes.
And they lived with this, didn't they?
Absolutely. That was everyday life.
That was everyday life.
Yeah. And
go ahead.
I was gonna say, one of the interesting pieces to this is that we talk about, I think the world population grew slowly over the centuries before 1800. About the beginning of 1800, we hit 1 billion people. And of course, we're over 7 billion now, pushing on towards 8. And so a lot of people ask, why did the population suddenly explode like it did? Well, there's several reasons. But one of the things that happened is because we slowly reduced the child mortality rate, and then that snowballed. You had the number of children being born. So if you had 6 children in the past, and maybe 3 of them lived to adulthood and go on to have children, so you've lost half your kids in terms of them going on to reproduce themselves. And you're able to reduce child mortality rate, and now suddenly, instead of 3 of them living, 4 and 5 of them are living, and now 6 are living. In most cases. Then if you can continue to have children at that rate, then obviously they're going to grow up to have children, and their children are all going to live. And if you don't reduce the rate at which children are being born, you have a population explosion. And that's exactly what we had. The child mortality rate began to fall. So more children were living, becoming adults, and then mortality rates, the birth rates began to fall later after the mortality rates did. Right. And so that's the reason you have the big explosion in population. It's also why population growth is declining. The rate of increase is declining. It will level out some point later in this century. Right. But the child mortality rate declining, and then followed by the fertility rate declining after that. That's the reason we've had the big population explosion.
Yeah. So in 2017, the child mortality rate in the first 5 years was 3.91%. So a little less than 4%. That's just incredible. Yeah. And let's talk about why did that happen? What was it that led to the decline of child mortality?
Oh, there are so many different factors. Learning about health issues. Modern science in terms of learning about viruses and bacteria, how to you had in hospitals, women would go to have a birth, doctor have a birth, he'd move back from one patient to another patient without washing hands, and then you infect the mother when she's giving birth to the child. there's just so much that we learned in terms of medicine that improved things. As the Industrial Revolution carried on, it was ugly at first. But by the time you start getting to the late 19th century, you decrease the need for child labor. So you no longer have children working in dangerous situations in factories and in mines and that type of thing. That begins to decline. So that begins to increase the ability of children to live. The improving diet around the world, the growth in agriculture and having more food available. You could feed children and have them survive. Children are often vulnerable to famine and to other issues that frequently struck society. So there's just a whole plethora of things that have fed together in order to decrease child mortality.
And let's also talk about modern medicine as well. And
exactly.
And let's bring up vaccines.
In the most recent decades, absolutely,
we had gotten rid of through vaccination diseases that killed a lot of children and a lot of people.
Exactly,
just smallpox and polio, and so for all the controversy today about vaccines, actually they have demonstrated that epidemiology, vaccine science is pretty sound stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll say too that another aspect, I mean, that definitely over the past, probably since World War II coming forward, the ability to vaccinate children against diseases. But another piece of this that in particularly in recent years, we talked about education a minute ago. Why is education important? Being able to be literate, so on and so forth. Well, what we've seen over the past 2 or 3 generations is the empowerment of women. And in many of these societies, the women are the primary caregivers for children. They are better educated in terms of and have better access and ability to access information because of their education. They are also better able to be caretakers for the children in their societies. And their income has increased in society. That improves their ability to be better parents within the family. So that also has contributed to the improving welfare of children.
There's a funny interesting story about John Adams and Ben Franklin, who at times didn't get along with each other, very different personalities, but there's a story where they're traveling together and they bed down in a tavern for the night, and they have this room, and they're both in the same bed. And Ben Franklin at the time had this theory that fresh air was good for the health, that stagnant air was not good. And even though they didn't quite understand it yet, he had this theory, which turns out to be right. And John Adams just drove him nuts because it was cold. He didn't want to be cold. But Franklin insisted on opening the window so that they could have fresh air, right? But he turns out to be right. And so there's a lot of that stuff. So, well, this is good. So we've had that go down, and that has, and by the way, real quick, because you mentioned population, and by the end of the century, maybe going down. We don't hear much anymore about the threat of overpopulation, do we? We used to. That was a big concern of some people, but that's not playing out, is it?
You don't hear as much about it now. I do think there's still a concern by a sizable group of people that the population will continue to grow. We're about 7.5 billion now. Used to be that they thought by the end of the century we might have 11 billion people. I think more realistic projections are somewhere probably in the 9.5 to 10 billion range, from what I understand. Who knows exactly? I've got my reasons for thinking that the conservative side of that may be more realistic. We won't get into all that right now. But anyway, let's say 10 billion people. I think the concern that I hear more frequently now gets more to the issues of climate change and resource depletion, because we're still continuing to grow, and that's going, and particularly if living standards are going to increase for people across the world, that's going to mean even consumption of more resources, more damage to the planet, that type of thing. And so I think that's more where I hear the concern is more specifically in that direction. Not that we're necessarily going to run out of food because we can increase the capacity, but because we're going to end up destroying the climate trying to do this. I think that's
well, we need to have a future episode on climate change, since neither one of us is an expert, but it certainly is out there and of concern. And so maybe we should have a conversation exactly about that. So we'll put that on the back burner. So let's talk freedom.
Yeah.
This one's a little more complicated as far as, but the green at the bottom is population in democracy.
Right.
And the one at the top, where did it go? Okay. This population in a colony is the top. It's sort of purple.
Right.
And you've got the darker red autocracy. So the point is, the lower you get to the bottom, the more we're talking free society, I'm assuming.
Correct.
All right. So in 1817, less than 1% of the world, excuse me, less than 1% of the world lived in a democracy.
Right.
In 2015, 55.8% live in a democracy. And the article here makes it very clear that freedom leads to better living conditions. Why is that, Michael? I mean, isn't it better for me to have a dictator to take care of me?
Well,
how's that work?
My position on that would is that people generally are the ones who know best what it is that they need in order to prosper and thrive. That doesn't mean that we're always right, that we know everything we need to know, but we're the ones closest to our situation to be able to weigh and to evaluate what resources to use, not to use, and how to prioritize things. And if you do not have freedom for people to be able to choose how they are going to deal with their lives, and then be able to interact with other people on a free basis, to negotiate with them, to exchange for the things that they want, and to exchange with others the things that they need, you're always going to have a mismatch between what society is creating and what people need. And as that mismatch grows, the people become restless, and that creates the need for a stronger central control in order for those that have the power to keep their power, because they can't meet the needs of the people. So freedom is essential for people being able to collectively work together to meet each other's needs. And that a collective ability to do that is what creates stability and tends to limit autocratic power.
Okay. So an argument for democracy here, that it does lead to human flourishing. In fact, one of the things that I would suggest, what we've seen in the last 5, 6, 7 years in our government and politics is a movement away from that toward more authoritarian forms. And support of that. And when you do surveys, and people are more people are expressing the idea that we may even need to resort to violence to restore our rights, whatever that might mean. It really is a cover for, and then and people who say this probably don't even realize this, but it's a cover for authoritarians. It's a cover. It's a way to give to authoritarians the green light.
Right. And I think it's not just the United States we're seeing this.
No.
You see this in Europe, you see it in India, you see it in various other places. There are elements that are arising that are pushing this more autocratic way of doing the world. And ironically, I think that is because there has been so much freedom, there has been so much exchange that is now threatening the old order of things that many people were familiar with and valued. And this is a reactionary movement to try to halt that change that's happening. That's not to say that all the change has been good, or that
no,
that's happening to the economy. I don't want to exaggerate in the other direction, but I think there is a fear and an angst about where the world is going, because what was and what was familiar appears to be passing away, and it's not clear what's coming up in the future, and that always creates a reactionary response.
Right. And so I mean, I believe in freedom. I like freedom. I enjoy my freedom. I want my freedom. I'm not really comfortable though with certain other people's freedom.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
And
it's okay for you to be free as long as I'm running the show.
Yeah. Right.
As long as I'm in charge, or we are in charge, whoever we might be.
That's right.
Yeah. Oh, it all just depends on whose ox is being gored. That, I got to tell you, that's one of my favorite lines. I use that anymore all the time.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Okay. Population. Well, we've talked about that. I'm going to, for the sake of time, move on. But education. Let's projected world population by education level.
Yeah.
So at the top, you've got the blue, which is post-secondary. And post-secondary is, what is that? College and beyond.
I think, let's see, we got lower secondary, upper. I'm not sure what their divisions were here. I don't remember now looking at the details as to where they broke things up. Lower secondary, I'm assuming, is probably.
Well, lower secondary is primary. So I'm assuming that's maybe that's through high school.
I'm having a problem reading incomplete primary. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so then upper secondary would be like college, maybe post-secondary would be graduate school.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay. But so in 1970, this just goes back to 1970, upper secondary, which is college.
Yeah.
College or vocational school. 3.0765 million. And again, I'm not sure why this graph is doing what it's doing.
Trying to get the edge there. There you go. Yeah, sensitive.
All right, so let me go back. There we go. Post-secondary 101.46. Let's do upper secondary because that's college.
Right.
3.07. Lower secondary, so that would be high school diploma, 294 million.
Right.
And lower secondary, 679.8 million. I mean, that's just a huge jump. So you've got 400 million additional people with a high school diploma.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Right.
What does that do? Why do we have that level? Why is that level of education so important? I mean, so let me say this. One of the other things is, and you know this, when immigrants come to this country, first generation of immigrants, they work hard to establish themselves, to establish their families. And they don't, most of them, not all of them, but most of them don't have what you would call an upper secondary education. But they work hard because they want to provide that for their children. And the stories that we've heard of immigrants who, you know, they come over here when they're young and they work hard for all their life, and just absolutely beyond tears of joy when their child gets a high school, a college degree. First one in the family, right?
Sure.
Or the first one in the family who gets the PhD. And the immigrants who their parents, grandparents who work so hard to make this life are just thrilled for this. Why? Why is it so important?
Well, I think that we were talking earlier that education just opens up so much more opportunity in terms of earnings and quality of life, respectability, networks of people that you interact with. There's just so much that education brings. And just also the fact of personal fulfillment and enhancement, that being able to be a learned person on topics that you're interested in has been a luxury throughout most of humanity, and now it's becoming the norm.
Yeah. Wow. So
in our lifetimes,
so let's get out of the share screen here, and so overall we could say, all right, so as we've looked through this, the big picture here is in general, around the world, things are better than they were 150 years ago.
Yeah.
And there's multiple reasons why that's the case.
Right.
All right. Well, let me give a little of the downside to this here a little bit.
Good.
We'll talk about that because that's
there's
important.
a lot of it.
That's important.
Yeah.
So you sent to me this Gapminder thing, which is really helpful too. All right.
Yeah.
So there are 4 levels of people in reference to income,
Right.
or in reference to what they live on, and I'll just give those to you. Level 1, which is the lowest, $2 a day, and so that's pretty poor.
Right.
Right. Level 2 is $8 a day. That doesn't sound real good.
No.
But those are probably the people who you mentioned earlier who are not in extreme poverty. They're able to eke out more of a living, maybe with less insecurity, but it's still not an existence you would want to have.
No. Yeah. It's much improved. There's stability. You're not necessarily always on the verge of dipping below, not having things. Yeah. Right.
Level 3 is $32 a day. I don't know. What would we call those folks? Would they be lower middle class? Is that fair or not?
Well, by American standards, they probably be, we would certainly call them lower middle class, but I think by world standards, that's probably the middle class of the world.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And then level 4 is above that. And this is where you start to get, living the middle class, they're comfortable. They're able to do some saving. They've got access to things. Okay. So here's what I want to say. The richest billion people on earth live at level 4.
Right.
I dare say you and I would be level 4, Michael.
We are well into level 4.
We are well into level 4. So 4 billion people. Now I hear that at first glance and I say, well, that's pretty good. 4 billion people.
Yeah, a billion people. Yeah.
What did I say?
A billion people. Yeah.
The richest billion. Did I say billion? Yeah, I'm getting my numbers confused.
Yeah.
This is why we have you, Michael, because math was not my strong suit. I'm the guy, as I've said, this is a true story. In 9th grade algebra, I was the guy that raised my hand in class and said, if X equals 2, why not just put 2?
Yeah,
so I was destined to study philosophy, okay, not math. All right. So
I was
anyway,
concerned. I thought I heard you say 4 billion. I just want to make sure.
No, the richest billion. I was thinking of level 4. Right, the richest billion. Okay, so I hear billion and I think, well, that's pretty good, Michael. We got 1 billion people around the world living that are living middle class or above.
Right.
That doesn't tell the whole story, does it?
No, it sure doesn't.
How many people are living below that?
Probably about 1 billion, so probably 6 to 7 billion, closer to 7 billion are probably living below that. Yeah. So that's a chunk.
And those who are in extreme poverty, I thought I had read that, and now all of a sudden I can't find where I've read it.
Yeah, it's probably a billion, give or take, a little
less.
A
billion, give or take. So that's a lot of people
right.
who are not sure where tomorrow's meal is coming from.
Exactly.
So that tells me that in the midst of all this good news, and that we should all rejoice in, because we as Christians, we want every human being is made in God's image, and Jesus died for every single person, and we want everybody to flourish, and so we're happy about that. But that happiness needs to be tempered, doesn't it?
Yeah, right.
1 billion people not sure where tomorrow's food is coming from.
Yeah.
One of the things that has struck me in recent years, Michael, being a preacher, is I remember one Lent a few years ago, did a series of sermons on the Lord's Prayer and really reflected on, give us this day our daily bread. Give us this day all the bread we need just for today. And I was thinking, how do I preach that in a society like ours where more people will die from too much bread and not enough?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
How do we, where there are people in this world, there are Christians in this world, when they say that prayer, they really mean it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, exactly.
it just puts things in perspective, at least for me, that I get to choose between rye or pumpernickel or whole wheat or whatever, sprouted grain, whatever it might be. And there are people that just would want a slice of bread. They don't care what kind it is.
Yeah, exactly.
What are some of the things that globally are being done and that we can do to reduce that billion, help reduce that billion of people?
Yeah, boy, that is such a complicated and difficult question. The temptation is to think purely in terms of, well, let's give some aid to those folks. Let's give them food and get them food to eat because they're hungry and they need food. And I think in some instances, in some circumstances, that's correct, and that is a part of the issue. But the larger issue is going back to Pope John Paul II, who said that poverty is not the absence of resources. Poverty is exclusion from networks of productivity and exchange. And so the real issue to getting people into a sustainable life where they can have reasonably healthy and flourishing lives is to have them included in networks of productivity and exchange. And so you ask, what is it that keeps them from being included in that? And a lot of this, I shouldn't say a lot of this, but a piece of this is geopolitics.
Yep.
There are historical, historical happenings that have led people to be in circumstances that makes it very difficult for them to be able to have governments that are accountable and responsible. We talked in our immigration piece about the people coming from Central America, coming to our borders, and people complaining that there's this big border crisis and it's all, our administration's fault for inviting these people here. Well, we're not literally inviting, but by supposedly leaving our borders open, we're inviting people to come across our borders. What you're seeing in many places in Central America are failed states, and the United States and its geopolitics has had a hand in creating that dysfunction, and more than a hand, in creating the dysfunction that happened in many of those countries that leads those people then to want to migrate, to move elsewhere. And so part of it is simply creating atmospheres where people can be included in the networks of productivity exchange that need to occur. Some places it does, this is always hard to figure out how to balance to say this just right. Direct aid is necessary, and there are places where that is helpful, but it generally is only helpful in places where there is accountability. You give direct aid to a country that has no real functioning institutions of civil society, you give them $5 billion, and 4.9 billion of that dollars goes into the pockets of elites and people that are in that country who have no intention of helping the people that are in their country. So it's a very complicated question. I do think that there are things in turn, that the church does in terms of that person-to-person level, giving people hope, of giving a vision. There's certainly are crisis situations that do require our extreme generosity in order to be able to help overcome immediate problems. But that is that's a triage question. That's a matter of getting people stable. But if that is all that we are doing, and we're not looking to the larger picture about how to include people in a stable economic system, then we're not getting the job done.
Well, yeah, I think of it as if I've got a guy in front of me overdosing on fentanyl, I'm going to give him Narcan. But there's a larger picture of hoping. I'm not going to deny him that. There's triage. Let's get him okay. Then there's the larger issue, though, of the issue of addiction. So, by the way, if you want a perfect example, this. If you want a perfect example of a country where that's exactly what you've talked about, it's happened, is Haiti. I went to Haiti. I was in Haiti for a while in the 80s, 1980s, when they were under dictatorship, and then that fell. But it's been one failed government after another, and we've tried to encourage democracy and elections and all of that. But you know, the politicians and the military are just corrupt as can be. And, you know, aid, they get most of it. They've helped themselves. And it's just a failed situation. And sadly, it's the Haitian people who have suffered over this.
Right.
So now, how do you work with that is a good question. As you say, it's very, very complicated. By the way, let me ask you a quick question to get your opinion on this. Tom Wright, who is a New Testament scholar,
right,
and we both know him. A lot of people know him. He's written lots of good stuff. He's been, one of his issues is third world debt.
Yeah.
And he would like, he's one of these persons who says we need to get rid of it. We need to erase it.
Yeah.
Because because developing nations like the United States and countries in Europe have used it as leverage to get some of these third world nations to do our bidding. What do you think about that?
That is a really complicated question.
Yeah. Well, listen, I major in complicated questions. So I'm not looking necessarily for easy answers.
Bring that down to a simple soundbite is not easy for me.
Yeah.
I would say in a general sense, I think there are cases where that probably is legitimate. That's probably a good idea. I mean, that's probably what needs to be done. I don't agree that is the blanket solution to what.
It's not the blanket solution.
Right.
Okay.
So it's not, it shouldn't be the case in every country. I mean, I think there are countries where there are differences. On a case-by-case basis, it may be legitimate. But again, the eliminating the debt, absent any other change in some of these countries, it still does not correct their situation or improve their situation. Part of what I'm hemming and hawing about here is, I don't want to make it sound like that the reason these countries are in the situation they're in is because it's all their fault. And,
right.
You know, that they had, if they just done things right, they'd be okay. Part of the reason that you have unstable countries in some regions of the world is colonialism created that instability. And you're still dealing with the overhang of colonialism in so many of these countries. And that was created by the West. So to have created that problem and then have the West just turn around and say, well, now see, you guys, you just won't do what you're supposed to do in terms of having a functioning government. It's all your fault. When we created the systemic issues that created their problem in the first place, that's a bit irresponsible. So, yeah, I think that there are cases where possibly reducing debt in conjunction with other changes, other reforms and things that may be helpful. But I think the larger picture has to be focused on how do you get a country stabilized and get them involved in terms of the economy.
Yeah. You know, Michael, when you talk like that, and we've had this conversation, I have to say that in recent years, and this is true not only about the subject at hand, but even in studying the Bible, I have become a big picture person in that we don't understand the large picture of things enough. And that includes the Bible. And, you know, we'd like to focus, you know, gosh, I was trained, I got my PhD in New Testament theology. You know, we're trained to look at minutia, you know, John's use of, you know, this word or that word. We're trained to look at minutia. But the one thing that I have discovered is that the real problem is we cannot see the smaller details of biblical text apart from the large picture of the Bible. Right. Because then what we do is we look at a little text. I mean, I had somebody say to me, this was in a social media conversation. I don't know how we were talking about the conquest and Joshua and all of that. And we were also then talking about westward expansion and, you know, what was called manifest destiny and all of that. And this person said to me, and my first thought was, I can't believe you just said that. But secondly, there's a part of me that said, well, you know, I don't think we in the church have done a good job of giving folks a big picture of the Bible. This person said to me in reference to us moving west and pushing Native Americans off the land, et cetera, said, well, you know, Joshua went into Canaan, so God didn't have trouble with conquest there. You know, and I wanted to say, wait a minute, right? Yeah. Because when you read those stories in the big picture, a different picture emerges.
Yes.
And so part of the problem here, not only with Bible, but with what we're talking about here. So as you mentioned, you have these countries that are in these dysfunctional governments. It's just a terrible situation. The people are suffering. People don't really, we haven't faced the hard history,
Right.
the difficult history, that in our history, we've had a colonialism problem, and we've helped create these problems.
Sure we did.
And, you know, you just get a different perspective when you look at the big picture. So I'm becoming a person who is in favor of generalizations.
Right.
Because otherwise you can't understand the details unless you
Right.
see the big picture. All right, let me stop there and let you respond to that.
No, I think that's good. I was reading some time back, I was talking about, imagine that you have somebody who's asking a question of a panel, which one's going to be the most persuasive? The first one is a sort of a novice who's done some basic reading about a topic and has developed some strong ideas about where they want to go with the topic. You have a master's student who hasn't really mastered the material yet and is very anxious to say anything because they're not really sure if they know what they're talking about. And then you get the PhD student, or the PhD who has mastered the field, who now knows they know what they don't know. And so therefore they're sort of qualifying what it is that they're going to say, because they've spent so much time with it. They know what questions to ask. They're probably very good at knowing which questions to ask, but may not exactly have the answers. Well, which one of those is going to be the most persuasive? It's going to be the first guy every time, because people like confidence. They like people who state things, boldly, and that this is what is the case. And in fact, the truth is probably better at learning what questions what are the appropriate questions? What are the central questions we need to ask?
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that I was just going to say, that this might get into a later discussion that we'll have. I think the tendency when I read economists, the idea of GDP, which we were talking earlier, was sort of this purchasing power GDP, where they try to normalize it across time and cultures and that type of thing. GDP is a imperfect measure of an economy, because it includes everything good or bad that is done for good or bad motives within that economy. And so the economists will simply tell you, well, we're not here to evaluate people's motives for the decisions they've made, but yet they will talk about sort of endless growth as being a good thing, that growth for growth's sake is good. And I don't think that's true.
Yeah.
But there are technical questions about how to create a better economy. On the theological side, I think our tendency is to look at economic issues as a sin and repentance issue. What are the things we're doing wrong? And if we just repent from doing those things wrong, everything will correct itself.
Yeah.
Neither of those get us to a good biblical reflection on what to do in terms of when. That's why I keep coming back to the idea of more calm conversations between economics and theology about how do we create a better world. And the tendency is for each of us to go to our corners and go for our strong suits in terms of
not enough just dialogue and conversation. And I noticed that years ago in the academy. I mean, just everybody does their own thing, and never the twain shall meet. And that's unfortunate. So you're also saying, Michael, that the guy that watches the 2 YouTube videos is more persuasive than the person who spent 15 years studying something.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
I think that's often the case. That confidence.
And when I talk about big picture, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about understanding the little pictures, the little fragments in the context of the larger picture.
Exactly. And that's what often I think when you come back to trying to say, well, what should we do about these little items? That larger picture sort of gives you a nuance that makes it hard sometimes to say, well, yes, here, but not there. Because it's how it fits into the larger picture of things. No,
I think that's good. Well, my goodness. Wow, this has been a great, I've loved all of our discussions. I'm thinking this might become my favorite, though. This has been really good. I have enjoyed this. Appreciate
good
insights. And so next month, you and I, we're going to talk about sort of piggyback on this, but we're going to talk about abundance versus scarcity. We're going to do that this month, but then you rightly, I think, suggested we go here, and it lays some good foundation for abundance versus scarcity. So You know, some of us think the sky is falling and the world is getting worse. And some of us also can think that scarcity is a big problem, and it may be in some areas, but how do we navigate through abundance versus scarcity? I'm guessing, just like in this subject, part of it depends where you stand in your social location, doesn't it?
Well, I'm sure that's part of it. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this will be a good discussion. I'm looking forward to that, and
Yeah.
we'll have an abundance of conversation on
All
that.
right.
And I'd like to talk about that too, because I think that that's an important subject. You know, we pastors kind of get in this abundance versus scarcity stuff in different ways. And, you know, again, my experience in other places, boy, you know what we probably should do, Michael? If we're going to do abundance versus scarcity, maybe in February, we should talk about climate change.
We could try that.
And we can just see what's going on out there and try and get past the memes on all of that. Well, anyway, we'll see. But next month, abundance versus scarcity. Well, friends, thank you for joining us. Faith Seeking Understanding on our series, Calmly Considered. I thank you, Michael, always for a great conversation. And we'll be, boy, when we do this in January, we're going to have a better picture of the playoffs for football. By the way, what do you think about the lockout in baseball? Just curious.
I don't know. I hope they get it resolved before the season starts, because I'm really looking forward to the Royals next year. So
well, this is the frustration that and I'm looking for the new Guardians. I'm looking for I love baseball. You know, I've always said, out of all the sports I like baseball's premier, right?
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you know, it's really hard. Maybe that's another thing in reference to abundance versus scarcity. It's really hard for the average person to relate to billionaires arguing with players who make millions, right? Billionaires and millionaires arguing over money. It's kind of hard to deal with. It's kind of hard to relate to that, isn't it?
It sure is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It does make
so
it
just
hard.
Get out on the field, be quiet, and hit the baseball. Because we want to go and spend too much money for popcorn while we watch you.
Exactly.
That's an interesting
ballpark Franks. There you go.
That's an interesting scenario in and of itself. Well, friends, this is Faith Seeking Understanding, and I'm Allan Bevere, and I want you to, with Michael Cruz, and let's end with the quote I always end with, Anselm of Canterbury, who said, "I do not seek to understand that I may believe, but I believe in order to understand." All right, friends, keep seeking. Take care.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.